Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am so thrilled that you are all here today to join us for this, yet again, another wonderfully informative webinar from our friend and colleague, Betsy Mayotte. Betsy is with the Institute of Student Loan Advisors and is a national expert on all things student loans. And of course, these days we have to call her in on a regular basis to help us decipher and understand everything that's going on. So welcome to Betsy. I know most of you as I look at the attendees, but just for those of you whom I haven't met, my name is Mary Dyer and I'm a financial education program manager at FAME and thrilled to be here today. A few housekeeping details that I mentioned earlier, but I'll just mention again, we are recording this webinar. We will make a recording of the webinar available on the FAME website. We'll have the slide deck available as well. And as we move through the webinar, we have 1 hour today, but know that we are available to help you with questions after the fact. If you have specific student loan related questions that you don't want to put in the chat and ask publicly in that forum, certainly you can reach out to me anytime after the fact and I can work with Betsy if it's a question that I can't answer, which is sometimes or often the case these days. So certainly feel free to follow up with us, but during the webinar, you can place any questions that you might have in the chat. Betsy will pause throughout. We'll answer what we can. Mila Tappan is also with us today from FAME. And so she and I will do our best to answer questions in the chat, but we'll pose some of those questions along the way to Betsy as well. So with that, I'm going to stop talking now and turn it over to Betsy and let her take it from here.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Mila. I am going to shut my camera off because I guarantee you my face will add 0 to this presentation. I'm tickled that to have you all here today. Those who know me know that I love talking about student loans, and there certainly has been a lot to talk about recently. As we mentioned, I am going to take questions along the way. If you want to put them in the chat panel, I'm going to take a breath every now and then and see if there's any questions that might be good for the whole group to hear or that haven't yet been answered. I much prefer a conversation rather than me sort of Charlie Brown teaching at everybody. So because we have the size of the group we have, I may actually also if people are interested, give people the opportunity to just raise their hand and take themselves off mute as appropriate to ask the questions. We'll have to see how that goes. Okay, so let's dive right in. So what we're going to cover today is I'm going to give you the latest on what people are calling the Biden-Harris debt relief. I wish we had a sexy name for it. I will tell you that as someone who's been in this industry since the earth cooled, we're not real good at the sexy names for these programs, so we're stuck with Biden-Harris debt relief. And then I'm going to talk about the PSLF / income-driven plan waiver. And some of you might be going, PSLF waiver? I thought that expired. Well, it did, except where it didn't. So we're going to cover that. And then if we have time, I wanted to make sure you were aware of some very recent guidance that came out around what the Department of Ed is calling the Fresh Start program, which is something that's a real benefit to a lot of borrowers that might have loans that are in default. So that's sort of the order of things. Before I get into any of that, though, a question that the last couple years have been really bananas when it comes to temporary waivers. And they've all been amazing. And I especially appreciate how thoughtful this administration has been about trying to target especially the most vulnerable borrowers. But it's starting to cause some confusion amongst consumers. Because let's face it, unless you're a student loan nerd like me, you might not understand, well, why are we doing this now? And why is it only temporary? Why don't they just do this all the time? So I found it useful to take a couple minutes to sort of explain all of those whys. Why are we getting all these waivers now? Why are they only temporary? And more importantly, lately, are they at risk for reversal? So, as you know, as most of you are aware, I hope all of you are aware, we don't have a king. here in the United States. And because we don't have a king, the president of the United States is restricted into what actions that he and hopefully at some point in the future she can take. Congress is really the one that sets policy through federal legislation that is written into federal law. Now, while the president does have executive powers, those powers, for the most part, are restricted to things that are written into the law. So, in other words, the president of the United States normally does not have the authority to do something that is contrary to federal law. Now, there are some exceptions to that, and a big exception was written into the HEROES Act in 2003. And essentially, the HEROES Act, Congress gave the President of the United States authority during a national emergency to do stuff that's contrary to federal law. So that answers our first two questions. Why now for these waivers and initiatives, and why are they only temporary? So, with all the havoc that COVID has caused, COVID is actually who we have to thank for these temporary waivers and initiatives, because COVID caused us to be put into a national emergency. And again, because of the HEROES Act, that national emergency does allow the President of the United States to do things that are contrary to federal law. It also explains why they're only temporary, because once the national emergency is over, then his authority to do things that are contrary to federal law also expires. Now, are they at risk for reversal? Oh, we're about to find out. Recently, one of the authors of the HEROES Act very specifically said to the press, so publicly and purposefully, said that the actions that President Biden has taken using the HEROES Act as his authority is exactly what the HEROES Act was written for. But there's other members of Congress that have said he is going beyond the intent of the HEROES Act. And that's why we're seeing some pushback, at least on the broad Biden-Harris debt relief. And I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. So whether or not he has gone beyond that authority remains to be seen, but we are going to find out in the next couple months. If you go and read the HEROES Act, the language is, to me at least, is pretty clear, and it's pretty succinct. We're not talking about pages and pages and pages of federal law language here. We're talking about one sentence, and that sentence, to me, seems pretty broad. Now, when I say to me, you need to keep in mind that I'm not an attorney, and you should listen to nothing that I have to say that in any way appears to be legal advice, because I don't have the credentials nor the education to give that. But so that's where we're at now. If it turns out that the Biden Harris debt relief is reversed or stopped by the Supreme Court, that certainly would put some of these other initiatives, such as the income-driven plan waiver or even the public service loan forgiveness waiver, at risk. Now, with that said, before you panic, don't, because especially with the PSLF waiver, nobody has challenged the PSLF waiver, and if they were going to challenge it, they would have done so by now. The other thing to keep in mind about the PSLF waiver is that it affects a very small percentage of student loan borrowers. So, again, if someone was going to challenge it, they would have done so by now. And I don't see anyone challenging it in the future because, quite frankly, the optics are terrible. If you think about who public service loan forgiveness was intended to benefit, you're looking at your firefighters, your nurses, your teachers, your police officers, all very sympathetic professions. And anybody that would try to challenge the PSLF waiver might as well put a video up on TikTok of them kicking a puppy in the rain. So for that reason, again, the small impact and the negative optics of challenging it, I am not worried about the PSLF waiver at all. The income-driven plan waiver, on the other hand, that has much broader implications. Some might argue that it might even have as much of a dollar impact as the debt relief could. So I think I I don't think the horse is out of the barn yet on the IDR waiver piece. I suspect that anybody who might be considering challenging it is probably going to wait and see what's happening with the Biden-Harris debt relief. And then all the other ones, again, they're even smaller populations than, and when I say all the other ones, I mean all the other waivers we've seen, such as the ones related to total and permanent disability. There's been some with borrower defense. Those all affect even smaller populations of borrowers. So, and very, very sympathetic borrowers optically. So I'm not worried about those at all. And then finally, the biggie is the extended repayment pause and the 0% interest. Now we're going to be over 3 years by the time the dust has settled on this. That one, again, I don't think is at risk for reversal because it was the other side of the aisle that started it. So if you challenge the president on that, then you're also challenging the president to put it into place in the first place. So again, I'm not particularly worried at any sort of reversal for the broad payment pause. So that's just a little bit of background about why we're here in the first place. So with that said, let's talk about the elephant in the room, which is the one-time student loan debt relief. Just as a recap, I know there's some financial aid professionals here on the call. I know there's also some consumers on the call, and I don't want to assume that people already know all the things. So let's review the things. So here's the basic eligibility for the Biden-Harris debt relief. All Department of Education held loans are potentially eligible for the debt relief. Now, so that what that means is every single federal direct loan, whether that be a Stafford loan, a Graduate Plus loan, a Parent Plus loan, or a consolidation. And it does not matter for the most part when the loan was made. If you have a vintage 1994 federal direct loan, which 94 is the first year they were made, that is just as potentially eligible for the Biden-Harris debt relief as a loan that was made in 2021. That also includes Perkins loans and federal family education loans that are outright held by the Department of Education. All defaulted federal loans are eligible for the debt relief, and any FFEL or Perkins loan that was consolidated, that was not held by the Department of Ed, and that consolidated or applied for consolidation prior to September 29th of 2022. And I'll explain in a minute why we have that oddly specific cutoff date. Now, all that might sound a little confusing, so here's the short answer. If you have a loan that's eligible for the COVID pause, meaning you haven't been due for a payment since March 13th of 2020, and you've been enjoying a 0% interest rate, then that loan is eligible for the Biden-Harris debt relief. Now, let's talk about that oddly specific September 29th date. On August 24th, when the Biden administration initially announced the debt relief, it actually included all federal loans, with the exception, it included all federal student loans, including the FFEL or Perkins loans, regardless of whether they were held by a private lender, which we call commercially held FFEL, or held by a school, or whether they were held by the Department of Ed or not. And then the lawsuit started coming in. Now, in order for a lawsuit to have any legs, like people can't just sue because they're mad at stuff. They have to have what's called standing. And what standing means is that you have to show that you personally have been harmed by whatever action's been taken. Now, as I'm going to talk about more in a few minutes, most of the lawsuits that came in had little or no standing. But one lawsuit that came in, which is Nebraska versus the Department of Education, that was filed by 6 states, and what those states had a few things in common. One of the things that they had in common is they were all red states. The other thing that they had in common is that they all house a servicer or lender that participates in the old federal family education loan program. Now, they haven't made FFEL loans since 2010, but they were the primary federal loan program for 40 years. So there's still a decent size, multiple millions and tens of millions of dollars of a portfolio left. And if you think about the fact that in order to qualify for the debt relief, the FFEL borrowers were being told that they they might need to consolidate to get access to the debt relief, though those group of states were saying that their states were potentially harmed by this because they were losing out on future revenue on these loans. So these loans would be consolidated, and yes, they'd get reimbursed, but they wouldn't have the 10 or 20 year of repayment and interest in front of them that they, or maybe some of these loans had been packaged into investments and securitized, and that they were losing out on the revenue for that. And that potentially was standing. That was something they could potentially prove that they would have been harmed by. So in order to try to preserve the broad debt relief program, unfortunately, the Department of Education had to sort of make a Sophie's choice. And they chose to sacrifice the few to save the many. While there is still a substantial FEL portfolio, compared to the overall federal loan portfolio, it's very, very small. I believe at this point it's 10% or less of the overall federal loan portfolio. So in order to preserve that broad debt relief, the Department of Ed made an announcement on the 29th of September that if the FEL borrower or the Perkins had not initiated a consolidation application by the day before, that they would no longer be able to consolidate. They could still consolidate, but they wouldn't be able. Consolidation would not give them access to the debt relief. So that was very unfortunate, because there were a lot of people, including people at the Department of Ed and myself, that were telling these borrowers that they didn't have to rush to consolidate, because the Department of Ed had also been saying that they were trying to find a way, and they still are trying to find a way for FEL and Perkins borrowers to access the debt relief without consolidating. And some people took that advice and waited because they thought they had plenty of time. And then all of a sudden there was essentially this retroactive deadline. So I understand why the department did what they did, because by doing that, they essentially took away any standing that those states might have. But again, we'll talk more about that, the Nebraska versus Department of Ed lawsuit, in a few minutes. But that I just wanted to explain why we sort of had that abrupt, oddly specific and retroactive deadline. Now, I will say, for those people that were negatively affected by that announcement, that the Department of Ed has still committed to trying to find a way to allow these unconsolidated and commercially held FEL and Perkins loans to get access to the debt relief. I guarantee you it's not a priority until the lawsuits are said and done. But I do know for a fact that they are still going to try to find a way for them to benefit from it. Now, the other requirement, and really the only other requirement for the Biden-Harris debt relief, is income. So they're looking to forgive up to $10,000, and for borrowers that have received a Pell Grant at any point in their academic career, up to $20,000 of loans for borrowers whose adjusted gross income for either 2020 or 2021 was below $125,000, and that's the threshold for a single borrower or for married borrowers that file their taxes separately. For a couple that is married and filing jointly, or someone who's head of household for the years 2020 or 2021, that limit is an adjusted gross income of no more than $250,000. Now, it's either or. So if you made $5 million in 2020, but you made $124,000 in 2021, you're eligible. But if you made $126,000 in both years, unfortunately, you're not eligible. So it is an all or nothing, but it's either 2020 or 2021. Now, one question I get quite often is, what if my income, what if I didn't meet the threshold, or I was over the threshold in both of those years, but in 2022, I had a significant reduction in income, and that year would qualify. Can I make an appeal? And the answer is no. I've also been asked that because of the court cases, do I expect the Department of Ed or the administration to loop in the year 2022? And my answer to that is no as well. The deadline for applying for the debt relief remains, even though applications are temporarily closed. I'm going to talk about that in a minute too. The deadline remains December of 2023. We expect the decision from the Supreme Court by June of 2023. So none of those dates have changed. So I don't expect them to be adding another income year to that either. Now, if someone was actually enrolled and attending school and they were in undergraduate school and were considered a dependent student for financial aid reasons, meaning they're undergraduate student, they're less than 24 years, they're under 24 years old, they're not married, they don't have any dependents of their own, and they're not an orphan or a veteran, their eligibility for the debt relief is going to be based on their parental income. So that's for students who were considered dependent students and were enrolled in school between July 1st of 2021 and June 30th of 2022. Something else to note about students that were in school recently, the cutoff for loans that are eligible are loans that were, the loans had to have had at least one disbursement as of June 30th of 2022. So most students who, had loans for the 22-23 academic year that wouldn't have been dispersed until August or September, those loans are not eligible. Even if it was approved before June 30th, what matters is when the initial disbursement went out. So the vast majority of loans for the 2022-2023 academic year are not going to be eligible. Now, someone in that situation could have other loans that are, loans they took out the prior year would be potentially eligible. It's just loans that had no disbursements as of June 30th that are not. If you're not sure when your loan was dispersed, there's three ways actually that are pretty simple. One, you can call and ask your school. Two, you can log on to your loan servicer account and it should show you the first disbursement date. Or three, you can go to studentaid.gov and log in and it will definitely show you your first disbursement date. Now, as I mentioned, they're going to forgive up to $10,000 for all eligible borrowers. But now, when I say up to $10,000, what I mean is that for the most part, if you owe, let's say you only owe $8,000, they'll forgive the $8,000, and for the you're not going to get the extra $2,000 in the mail for the most part. I'm going to talk about the exceptions to refunds in a minute. Now, if you received a Pell Grant, as I mentioned earlier, at any point in your academic career, then you're eligible for up to $20,000. Now, when I say at any time in your academic career, I really, really mean it. Now, I usually get a, but what about questions? If you got a Pell Grant at any point in your career, you're eligible for the 20 grand. That includes if you have Parent Plus loans now, but you got a Pell Grant back from when you went to school 30 years ago, you're potentially eligible for the 20 grand. If you took out the Pell Grant in a year where you didn't take out loans, doesn't matter. You're potentially eligible for the 20 grand. There is not a single iteration of that question that you can ask me where the answer is not going to be, you're potentially eligible for the 20 grand if you got a Pell Grant at any point in your career. As I mentioned, there are no refunds if you owe less than the forgiveness amount, except in the case for people who made payments during the COVID pause. In that situation, there could be the potential for a refund, and I'm going to get into that in more detail in a second. And finally, the other question I get quite a bit is the eligibility for this debt relief is on a borrower by borrower basis, not on a family basis. So if you have a family unit of 2 parents and 3 kids, and both parental units and all 3 kids have student loans, and they all meet the income threshold, and they all receive Pell Grants, you have the potential for $100,000 in student loan forgiveness in that family unit. One thing I don't remember if I emphasized as far as eligible loans go, defaulted loans are eligible for this, and that includes defaulted FFEL. So we're kind of in the weird position right now that for borrowers that have a defaulted FFEL loan, normally I'd be working with them to get the loans out of default as quickly as possible. That's not necessarily the best advice right now. It might be better to stay in default until the debt relief goes through, if it does go through, and then get your remaining balance out of default. All right, before I get into the application and other things, are there any questions about anything that I've covered so far?
No
I see.
questions yet, Betsy. I've got one for PSLF later on because I know you're going to cover that. But I think we're all set for now.
Okay. I'll just give people another second to see if anyone wants to raise their hand. And yeah, I would do ask that you hold off on questions about things that haven't covered yet. Because if I do my job right, I will cover it when I get to that section anyway. All right, I'm not seeing any raised hands, so I'm going to move on. All right, so the application unfortunately has been paused due to the court proceedings. We fully expect that once the court proceedings are done, if they go the way we want them to go and the court blesses the debt relief, that the application will open up again. If you go to studentaid.gov, that's where the application used to live and will live again. That's also where you can go to sign up for email updates for when the application will reopen. So instead of having to check studentaid.gov every day, you can sign up for these email announcements, these emails that will go to you once the application is open. There's about 8 million people that didn't have to apply at all. Those are people that submitted generally people that submitted a FAFSA within the last year or two, or people that submitted income information for an income-driven plan in either 2020 or 2021. Now, those people were sent an email already that gave them the opportunity to opt out of debt relief. Believe it or not, there are some people that don't want the debt relief. Specifically people that live, what I've seen is people that live in a state, there's 4 states right now that would tax this debt relief. It's not going to be taxed at the federal level, but there are 4 states that will tax it. And in those states, public service loan forgiveness is not taxed. And I've seen people that are on track for public service loan forgiveness, and they're going to get the whole thing forgiven without a tax. They've declined. They want to decline the debt relief because that amount would be taxed. The other people I've seen that are interested in opting out of the debt relief are people that are receiving some sort of financially based benefit. The one that comes up the most often is a housing benefit. So they receive some sort of federal or state housing benefit, and the having 10 or 20 grand forgiven, even whether or not it'll be taxed as income, will show up. And they're afraid that that will disqualify them from their benefit. So those are the other set of people that I've seen that are interested in opting out of the debt relief. Now, as I mentioned before, that once they do open the applications back up, the deadline to apply is going to be December 31st of 2023. I don't see that extending. There's not a 0 chance of it extending, but I'd say it's a really darn low chance of extending just because of the authority and the timeline we're looking at to be able to do this. Now, originally their goal was to apply the forgiveness before repayments were going to restart in January. So back when this was announced, payments were due to restart for COVID pause eligible loans in January. So what the department did is they had committed in writing that anybody who had applied by November 15th could be assured that whatever forgiveness they were eligible for would be processed before payments resumed in January. I'm not sure how that's going to work now moving forward, depending on when the Supreme Court does issue their decision based on the end of the payment pause. But I have some suspicions. So right now, the payment pause has been extended to no later than June 30th. And if for some reason the Supreme Court ruling comes back before that, they're going to end the payment pause earlier than June 30th. But the Supreme Court has already said we're already expecting that the written decision will come in June. Now, the way the regulations are written, the Department of Education and the servicers generally have about 60 days for a first payment to be due once a quote unquote forbearance ends. So if we assume that the payment pause is going to end on June 30th, they're really going to have until August, till the end of August to have people actually be due for a payment. They might go into a repayment status and have interest start accruing on July 1st, but they won't actually have to make them due for a payment until no later than August 30th based on those regulations. So I suspect, and this is pure speculation on my part, that if the debt relief is approved, but it's not approved till June, that they'll push people's next payments due out until the end of August and scurry to get that forgiveness processed for the applications they already have in house before that. And based on the timeline we saw before, I think that's possible. I think, they've already approved millions of applications that they already received. So it's just a matter of giving the servicers the instructions of how much to write off which account. So I think it is doable that if that's the timeline we end up with, that people who have already applied for forgiveness before they put a halt to the application could very well see their forgiveness be processed before they're actually due for a payment. Now, people that did apply received an email just confirming that their application was received. There rarely hasn't been any other communication since then, and there's no place for people to go and check the status of their application. And that's proved frustrating to some borrowers. People don't like to be left in the dark, but it is what it is, and I don't expect that to change. So once applications reopen and they start processing the forgiveness, you're just going to have to sit back and just be patient. Put your patience pants on, as I like to say. But it appears that the department is looking at a 6 to 8 week turnaround time from application to processing, again, based on the commitments they made, before all the court shenanigans started. All right, now the application itself, I forgot to mention this. The application itself, if you haven't seen it, could not be easier. You don't have to log in. You don't have to create a profile. You don't have to upload anything. You don't even really have to have much at your fingertips other than knowing what your adjusted gross income was in either 2020 or 2021 and your social security number. They ask you for demographic information. They ask you for your social security number. They ask if your income was below the threshold for either 2020 or 2021, and then they ask you to electronically sign it under penalty of perjury. That's important. There's a lot of grumblings out there. So the department was sort of in a just difficult situation when they were setting this up, because there was a lot of pressure being put on them by various members of Congress as well as advocacy organizations to make the process as simple as possible. Because the data shows that anytime you have any type of application process, it can prove to be a barrier to accessing these benefits. And this isn't just in the student loan world. This is in other, whether it be housing or other type of welfare benefits. Applications can prove to be a barrier to especially the most vulnerable populations out there that you're trying to serve. So the Department of Ed was under pressure to make the application process as simple as possible, preferably to make it be automatic and have no application at all. But on the other hand, they have a fiduciary duty to protect U.S. taxpayer money, and that's what this is. This is U.S. taxpayer money that's being forgiven, that's not going to be collected, that was earmarked for, future budgetary items. So because they had that fiduciary duty, part of what I actually think they did a good job. Again, the application takes less than 5 minutes. It could not be any easier. But on the other hand, they've made it clear that they've built in some sort of bells and whistles to help identify some borrowers or some answers in this application that might be a red flag for fraud, where someone's saying, yep, I made less than that amount, and chances are they probably made more than that amount and actually aren't eligible. So, and they will prosecute people that lie on this application, because again, you are filing that application under penalty of perjury. Another safety net that they sort of baked into this is that they're going to be selecting up to about 5 million people that apply that will be required to submit proof of income. They're calling it verification. Those of us that are in the industry, that's a word that might be familiar to you, and it's not much different than the verification that we see during the FAFSA process. If someone is selected for verification, they're not going to get forgiveness until they submit the required information. And if they don't submit it by March 31st, that's the end of it. And that's a hard stop of March 31st. If they've been selected for verification and they don't submit what they need to submit by that deadline, then they have permanently and forever lost their potential eligibility for forgiveness. Now they're going to have a choice of 3 items to submit. One is either a tax return from either 2020 or 2021, whatever year it was that you met the eligibility requirements income wise. If you don't have your tax return, you can request a tax transcript from the IRS for those years. And if you didn't file your taxes, you can submit, you can get from the IRS, and this is something super easy to get. You apply for it at irs.gov. Verification from the IRS that you weren't required to file taxes. Now, if you didn't file taxes, but you were required to, you're not going to be able to get that letter, and you're not going to be eligible for the debt relief unless you can scurry and get those taxes, those prior year taxes filed before the December 31st, 2023 deadline. And if you do get the verification requirement, they're also going to give you instructions on where you have to go to upload that information to the Department of Education for them to review. All right, so that's an explanation of the program. Are there any questions about the debt relief program before I get into the court shenanigans?
No debt relief questions, Betsy. We've got some others, but we'll hold those until we get to that section, okay?
Okay, thank you. All right, so let's talk about the court shenanigans. So as I have sort of mentioned along the way, when the debt relief came out, there was a bunch of lawsuits that were filed. And as I also mentioned, you can't just file a lawsuit because you don't like something, because it leaves a bad taste in your mouth, or you don't agree with it politically, or whatever. You have to have what's called standing. In other words, you have to prove that you also, before they even get to the merits of the case, you have to show that you would have been harmed. And most of them did not have what we would call standing. There was one case where this one actually sort of made me laugh. The first case that was filed actually by a law firm, and they actually used one of their own employees as the plaintiff. And what the employee was saying is that I'm going to be harmed because I'm going to be taxed on this forgiveness. I live in one of the 4 states that is going to be taxed for forgiveness. Well, unfortunately, they jumped in their excitement to file the suit. They jumped the gun a little bit. And that law firm is located in either Northern Virginia or DC. But the attorney that they used as a plaintiff, if you looked at their website when they filed the lawsuit, it showed that employee was living in Northern Virginia, which Virginia is not a state that is taxing it. And when the savvy reporter who discovered that the person who was the supposed plaintiff in this case didn't even live in a state where they get taxed, reached out to the law firm about it. They said, "Oh, well, he doesn't live in Indiana now, but he's moving there on Tuesday." Like, you can't make this stuff up. And then they very quickly updated their website. So that's one of the cases that got thrown out pretty quickly, because even if he had been living in Indiana right from the get-go, the solution to this is to just opt out and or not apply for the forgiveness, and then you're not harmed. So that was thrown out pretty quickly as to having no standing. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the case that had at least some teeth when it first started was the Nebraska versus the Biden administration, and that's the one that was filed by the 6 states. Some people unfortunately call it the Mohila case, which is unfortunate because even though Mohila is in Missouri, which is one of the 6 states, they actually declined to participate in the lawsuit when they were asked to by their Attorney General's office. And their Attorney General's office was first forced to file a Freedom of Information Act request to MOHELA to get the information they needed to file the case in the first place. So sort of unfortunately that people think that MOHELA is behind it when they actually aren't. It was filed by those attorney general's offices, and again, they declined to participate, which is a tough position for them to be in because, you know, to have your state AG filing a suit, you want to play nice in your state. But on the other hand, the Department of Education, who is the defendant in the case, is your biggest vendor. They stand to lose a lot more money if they were to lose their contract with the Department of Education. So it's a really unfortunate position that MOHELA has been put in here. So anyway, so they initially, this case did have some teeth because it's not untrue to say, now remember, before September 29th, they said that FEL borrowers, if they could consolidate and they would be eligible for the debt relief, they were also telling people that they didn't necessarily have to do it right away because they would try to find an alternative route. But a lot of people said, well, heck, I'm not waiting for that, and they consolidated right away. So it wasn't untrue to say that the agencies located in these states that still had FEL portfolios stood to potentially be harmed with future income-wise if there was a big drop in their remaining FEL portfolio due to this consolidation. So, as I mentioned before, the department took some pretty quick action. The day the case was filed, they put a cutoff of the day before of future consolidation, so they could no longer say that there was harm. Now the case has kept going, and on December 1st, so part of that case, and there's another case in the 5th District, which is Brown versus the Department of Education, which I'll talk about in a second. Those are the only two that have really gone anywhere. And what both of those cases have in common is they put an injunction on the forgiveness. They said, listen, until these cases are decided, you can't forgive any loans. So that's what happened first. And then they also ended up putting a moratorium on accepting future applications. So that's when the Department of Ed stopped taking future applications. And then finally, the department just said, or I should say the White House just said, listen, enough of these shenanigans, let's move this forward. And it was actually the White House, instead of letting things go their way, go at a normal case pace and see if it ended up at the Supreme Court, the White House specifically asked the Supreme Court to rule on this. And that happened on December 1st. I'm going to talk about how we should look at that request in a second, as far as trying to speculate on the outcome of this. But the Supreme Court has agreed to hear it. And in fact, I have a lot of people that are upset because they say it's taking so long. But the fact of the matter is, if you're familiar with the Supreme Court, and court proceedings in general for that matter, these things normally take years. But the SCOTUS has agreed to fast track this. They're going to hear oral arguments at the end of February, and they have stated that they will have their written decision in June. That is like Roadrunner lightning speed. And at this point, all we can do is wait. If this was a piece of legislation, I would be encouraging people to reach out to their members of Congress, to encourage them to pass the legislation that would make this forgiveness law. But this isn't legislation. This is a Supreme Court decision, and one does not lobby the Supreme Court. That's not supposed to be the way how it works. So the rest of us just really need to sort of sit back and wait and see what happens. The other case that is in the Supreme Court is the one out of the 5th District, which is Brown versus the Department of Education. Now, in this case, this was a borrower who did not consolidate by September 28th by the cutoff, and also there's multiple plaintiffs here, also a direct loan borrower who didn't receive a Pell Grant. They're suing this one. I don't know. Some people are calling it Karen versus the Department of Education. These people are suing because they're not going to benefit from the debt relief. So they're saying that because they're not going to benefit, that the whole program should be thrown out. what they're really trying to say, if you actually read what they submitted, what they're trying to say is that the Department of Education did not put the debt relief program out for public comment, and therefore it's illegal. Well, the last time I checked, executive orders were not required to have public comment. So this one, I'm actually really surprised, and in fact, a lot of other people are too, that this has gone as far as it has. Because all the people that are much smarter than I am, that actually are attorneys, have said that there's no standing here. And what was a surprise to them is that the Fifth Circuit judge that was ruling on this skipped right over the standing and just said, nope, the program's not eligible at all. And that's very uncommon, and some might say is inappropriate. So that case and all the other cases are sort of on hold now, pending what the outcome of the Supreme Court decision is. Now, I know I'm going to get asked, because I get asked all the time, is where do I think it's going to go? And honestly, it would be really irresponsible for me to sort of make a blanket statement, oh, I think it's going to get approved, or I don't think it's going to get approved. So again, going back to people that are much smarter than I am, what I'm hearing is people are pretty split down the middle about whether they think that the broad debt relief is going to go through. The fact that, first of all, you got to understand that the White House put a lot of effort in its legal team before they announced the program in the first place. And, you know, I can't imagine, and there's a lot of people that agree with me here, that they would have put this out in the first place if they thought that it was going to be an easy strike down, that if they didn't think they had a strong legal argument to begin with. And again, they're hanging their hats on the HEROES Act. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the original authors of the HEROES Act has publicly stated that what he did is square in the guidelines of what the HEROES Act said. So there's people that are looking at the fact that the White House is the one who actually asked SCOTUS to rule on this is an indication that they still feel very confident in their legal position, and that they never would have asked for it to go forward and be fast-tracked like this if they weren't confident. And therefore, they think that SCOTUS actually will bless it, that he did have the authority to do this debt relief. Now, there's other people that are just as smart that are worried about it. And one of the big indicators there is the fact that the New York Times and the Washington Post have both recently issued articles that are a little bit doom and gloom when it comes to the likelihood of this getting through the Supreme Court. And that's odd. The Washington Post in particular, you know, when they wouldn't opine on that in that direction lightly unless they felt that they had talked to legal experts that didn't think that the legal argument held water. So I guess I know this is probably not going to make anybody feel better, but I guess I'd say we're at about 50-50 right now about whether or not this is going to be approved. I'm an optimist. I am, you know, I'm probably personally, which you should take as nothing. You should not place any bets on my opinion on this. I'm feeling probably 70-30 that it will go forward. Now, with that said, if you're someone that received a refund, you know, as I mentioned before, people that made payments during COVID could ask for a refund, or if they ended up paying their loans down below the 10 or 20 grand that they stand to get forgiven. If you were someone that got one of those refunds or have one coming, I wouldn't spend it just to be on the safe side. I would put it in an interest-bearing vehicle. And if the debt relief goes through, awesome. You know, do something fun with it or responsible, depending on what you're feeling. But in case it doesn't go through, you'll have the ability to pay it right back again, instead of having it go back into repayment and earn interest and all and accrue interest and all that stuff. So that's what I had about the broad debt relief. Are there any questions about that before I get into the IDR waiver?
Betsy, just a very general question. If people, we got a question about if people, we have our group of people who have already applied for debt relief, and then we have the people who are eligible but haven't applied because they just hadn't gotten to it yet. if they go ahead and they approve debt relief, they'll all be basically treated the same way, won't they? In the sense that the people who would already applied will get their forgiveness if it goes forward, and the application will open back up, and then those who haven't applied will be able to do so. Obviously, the people who had already applied and been approved will get their money get forgiven first, or their debt forgiven first. Is there anything else within that you would think that
No,
I
I don't see any reason why anybody would be treated any different. The only
Okay.
amendment I'll make to your statement is I wouldn't necessarily assume that people are going to be processed in order of application. And I only,
Okay.
I mean, I think the chances are it's not all the realm of possibility, but based on what I've seen with the other waivers, it's not, when you get approved for something like this, is not just based on where you are standing in line. So I wouldn't make that
Okay.
assumption, but otherwise I expect everybody to be treated the same.
Okay, great. That was all on this particular topic then.
Okay, so let's talk about the income-driven plan waiver, or the one-time adjustment. So what this is I'm calling it like the PSLF waiver on steroids, because it affects a lot more people. And essentially, it ends up being a backdoor extension for the most part for 95% of the PSLF waiver. So any loan that's currently eligible for the COVID pause is eligible for this IDR waiver. So that includes all federally held loans, whether it's a direct loan, and that's Stafford, Graduate Plus, Parent Plus, Fell and Perkins loans that were consolidated, as long as they're consolidated by May 1st. Now, if you have a loan that's currently not eligible for the COVID pause, but it's a Fell or a Perkins, again, you can consolidate it by May 1st and to get eligibility for this IDR waiver. But where it stands right now, it is not eligible for this IDR waiver. Now, let's just really quickly do an overview of traditional income-driven plan rules, just so we can understand what the waiver is doing. So, traditional income-driven plan rules, the borrower gets on one of the IDR plans, and they don't have to be on the same one the whole time. They make payments that are based on their income and family size. They have to reapply for that on an annual basis, so resubmit proof of income and their payments adjusted accordingly on an annual basis. And then after they're on the plan for either 20 or 25 years, and that, whether it's 20 or 25 depends on what plan they're on, and in some cases depends on what kind of loans they have, that if there is a balance left over at the end of that 20 or 25 years, it's forgiven. Now, normally, if you consolidate your loans and you've already been on an income-driven plan, it resets the count. Now, the existing income-driven plans, they're all pretty much the same, except where they're different. And in some cases, they even have the same name, but completely different terms on different plans. But we have what we call old IBR, new IBR, the pay-as-you-earn plan, the revised pay-as-you-earn plan, and the income contingent repayment plan. Now, income contingent was the very first IDR plan to come into existence. It came into its existence in 1994 as when the direct loan program was introduced by Congress. It's probably the least used of the IDR plans because it tends to be, not all the time, but it tends to be the most expensive. Other than that, the oldest one on here is the one we call old IBR. That one didn't come into existence until 2009, and that's the only IDR plan that both FFEL loans as well as direct loans are eligible for. Now, what they're doing under the waiver, now remember, in order to get forgiveness under traditional IDR rules, you actually have to be on an IDR plan for at least for every single month of the 20 or 25 years needed for forgiveness under those plans. Now, if you consider the fact that the first widely used IDR plan didn't come into existence until 2009, there's really nobody, with the very, very few people that took up ICR, that income contingent, back in 94, there isn't anybody eligible for IDR forgiveness yet because, the oldest one other than ICR is that old IBR. That's only been around for 13 years. Now, what they're doing under the IDR waiver is they're going to give the borrower credit for every single month that they've been in repayment, regardless of whether they were under an IDR or not. And again, this is going to be a one-time adjustment. So let's say you've been paying your loan since 1990, but you've never been on an IDR plan. You could end up getting forgiveness right away because they're going to give you credit for every month you've been in repayment, even though you've never been on an IDR plan before. Now, what we're not clear about is how far back are they going to go. Now, there's 3 schools of thought here, and then I'm going to tell you which one I think they're actually doing. They could go back to 94, which would make sense because that's when the first IDR plan came into existence. They could go back to 2009 because that's when the first one that people actually used went into existence. Or they could go back to the dawn of time. The fact that when they announced the IDR waiver, that they didn't specifically say how far back they were going, that tells me they're going back to the dawn of time. Now, until I actually see a borrower who's been in repayment since pre-94 get their count, I'm not going to know for sure, but I am 95% confident that they are actually going back to since loans started back in the 60s. So especially for those older FEL borrowers that have been paying for decades, this is really going to benefit them. Now, the exception to this is they are not going to count periods where the loan was in default. And they are not going to count periods where the loan was in an in-school status or an in-school deferment or a grace period. Now, they are allowing, now, again, remember I said earlier, usually if you consolidate, it resets both your public service loan forgiveness and your income-driven plan count to 0. As long as you consolidate by May 1st, they will give you credit for every month that you were in repayment pre-consolidation. Now, these will also count for public service loan forgiveness, assuming you were working public service loan forgiveness eligible employment at the time of that payment month, and assuming it was after October of 07. So that's why this essentially, and it doesn't matter if the payment was late, it doesn't matter if the payment was for the wrong amount, it doesn't matter what plan you were on, they're going to count these for PSLF and IDR, which is why it's essentially, for the most part, a backdoor extension to the public service loan forgiveness waiver. Now, if you're consolidating loans that have different payment counts, say you have undergraduate loans that you've been paying on where you have 5 years worth of payments under your belt, and then you have graduate loans where you have 2 years of payments under your belt, if you consolidate by May 1st, the consolidation will get credit for the 5 years. It'll get credit for the higher count. If you consolidated more than once, you will get credit for all pre-consolidation payments prior to each individual consolidation. Now, there's no application for this. So they're just going to make the adjustment when they make the adjustment. For most people, they're not going to see this adjustment until next July or later. They are doing processing a few borrowers where the IDR adjustment will actually give them PSLF forgiveness. Those people they're actually processing now. They started in November and they're going on into December. So if somebody would end up getting forgiveness immediately under PSLF, if this IDR waiver is processed, then they're doing it now. Everyone else is going to have to wait till July. There is nobody that you can call and nowhere that you can look to see where you are in the queue for this. You just have to watch your account and watch your account on studentaid.gov starting next summer to see when that adjustment is made. There isn't a person on the planet that can get this processed for you any faster. Lost my train of thought of where I was going with that. Oh, one-time adjustment. So if once they do this adjustment, you actually won't be at the 20 or 25 years needed for forgiveness, you will need to be on an IDR plan going forward to accrue any future IDR payments. So if, this only gets you to 15 years, you will need to be on an income-driven plan for the next 5 or 10 years, depending on how many years you need in order to actually get forgiveness under the income-driven plans, even with this one-time adjustment. Now, when we say one-time adjustment, we mean one time. This will never happen again. So there are some people where their income driven plan amount is higher than what they pay now under a standard repayment plan or an extended repayment plan. Not everybody is going to get forgiveness. The program wasn't built to give even most people forgiveness. So if you're early on in your repayment journey, and this is back of the napkin, if your income is higher than your balance, chances are you're not going to get forgiveness. Chances are you are going to pay your loan off well before you would get any type of forgiveness. But if you've been paying for a very long time, it's very possible that this IDR waiver could give you forgiveness, if not right away, then pretty quickly. I know we're running out of time. I've run out of time. The Fresh Start program for defaulted borrowers, I know you're going to send out the slide deck. All the information about it is here, but essentially it's an opportunity for borrowers that are in default on their federal loans, even if they have used their one-time loan rehabilitation in the past, to get out of default without having to go through any type of shenanigans. They essentially will be able to get out of default right away, and it will clear their credit. The details are in the slides, and there's also some links for more information. But that program is going to be available to all federal loan borrowers. It's available to some of them now, but definitely by February. And the way to pull the trigger on that is to contact whoever is collecting the loans, collecting on your defaulted loans, and tell them you're interested in the Fresh Start program. I have time to hang out to answer as many questions as people have. So I think that's what we should probably do now, is get into
That sounds great, Betsy. Because we're recording, we'll go ahead. If people have a couple more minutes for questions, we'll go ahead and do questions now. Where we're recording, if you want to work through the Fresh Start slides, and then we'll have them for people, we can do that too. So we'll just
I love that idea. All right, let's do the
there.
questions. Let's do the questions that are on deck for the IDR waiver now.
Okay.
Then I'll do the Fresh Start.
Okay, I just got to get myself organized here. The first one was very early on before you talked about IDR, the waiver. But the question is, to whom does the extended time period of May, with a question mark, for consolidating loans, consolidating, say, a loan with 0 PSLF repayment months with a different loan where a borrower has more months tracked, banked, in order to assign months to the entire loan, apply? Is it for anyone who has a direct loan, or only for a small category of borrowers?
So I think I just addressed that, but it's for anybody that has a FEL, Perkins, or direct loan. The fact that you will get the highest count applies to everybody as long as they consolidate by May 1st.
Thank you. Are Parent Plus included in PSLF if consolidated by May 1st?
All right, so that's tricky. Parent Plus loans, for the most part, were excluded from the PSLF waiver. And when the IDR waiver came out, they were excluded from the PSLF portion of the IDR waiver. So essentially what the department originally had in writing there was Parent Plus loans will be given the one-time IDR adjustment, but you're not going to be able to use those payments towards PSLF, which I was very salty about. Now, what's interesting to me is that since then, they've actually taken that language off the website. And I've asked, when I saw that language was taken off the website, I asked if the policy had changed. And I was told, no, which makes me think that maybe they'll change their mind down the line. I'm very tinfoil hatting the fact that they took that language off the website. So as of right this second, you're still not eligible for the PSLF waiver portion. Parent Plus loans are eligible for PSLF, but they have to follow traditional PSLF rules. But I would not. I don't think this is over yet. It's possible that they could loop you guys in at some point.
All right, next question. What is the likelihood that borrowers on an extended repayment plan that are applying for temporary PSLF will get their prior payments counted? Are all payments counting, or just the ones that would have been equal to standard payment or something else?
They're all counting up till to May 1st. After that, you have to follow traditional if you're not at 120 by then you have to follow traditional PSLF rules. But every single payment prior to May 1st, as long as the borrower was working eligible employment and wasn't in default or in school, counts for PSLF. But again, after that, you have to be on an income-driven plan or a 10-year standard plan.
Thank you. This question pertains to debt relief. I thought that if the lender already had your income information, you didn't have to submit an application. It was only if they did not already have your income info.
That's right. And that's what I said during the presentation. But if you didn't get an email saying that you were automatically approved, then for whatever reason, they don't have it. And therefore you would have had to, you have to apply.
I think that's all for now, Betsy. Mila, did you see any others that I missed? They get a little funky in the Q&A when we answer them live. So I just want to make sure I didn't miss any.
Or
And
if anyone wants to raise their
No.
hand.
Yeah, I think we're good on the ones that were asked, Mary.
Okay.
All right. So let me sort of breeze through Fresh Start a bit. So I'm really delighted about Fresh Start because it truly is a Hail Mary pass. A lot of people don't realize this, but we work with a lot of borrowers that actually have been truly stuck in default. So normally if you default on a federal student loan, you have three options. You can pay the loan in full, which if you could have done that, you probably wouldn't have defaulted in the first place. You could consolidate the loans out of default, or you could go through a program called loan rehabilitation. Now, loan rehabilitation is where you make 9 consecutive on-time payments in an amount that's based on your income. And then once you make those 9 consecutive on-time payments, your loan is taken out of default. They remove the default line from your credit report like it was never there. And there's a significant reduction in the amount of collection costs you're charged on the defaulted loan. Now, consolidating out of default is good in that your loan's not in default anymore and your credit report is updated to show that it's no longer in default. But the fact that it defaulted in the first place still shows for the 7 years. And the collection costs are a bit higher, although not as high as just doing wage garnishment or tax refund offset and so on. The problem is that rehab is a one-time only thing. Once you use it, if you default again, you can't rehab again. And there are some direct loan borrowers who have already consolidated all of their loans. And you can't reconsolidate a consolidation loan unless you have other loans to consolidate with it. So those borrowers have literally been stuck in default. They want to bring their loan into good standing. They want to stop administrative wage garnishment. They want to start getting their tax refunds. They want to stop their Social Security from being garnished, but they haven't been able to. So that's one of the things that I'm most excited about this Fresh Start program. So what the Fresh Start program does, as I sort of mentioned already, is that if a borrower, and this is either a FFEL or a direct loan borrower, defaulted prior to March 13th of 2020, if they raise their hand on the Fresh Start program, and you raise your hand in one of two ways, either by applying for new loans because you're going back to school, or by reaching out to the collection agency and said, hey, I want Fresh Start. They're going to, within 30 days, is my understanding, take the loan out of default, put it back in good standing, meaning you're eligible for new aid, you're eligible for any of the lower payment options, you're eligible for PSLF again, you're eligible for the other forgiveness programs, deferments, and so on. And they're going to remove the default line from your credit report like it was never there. And it's not going to count against rehab. So if and I hope this doesn't happen, if you use Fresh Start and get taken out of default, but then you default again down the line, if you hadn't used it before, you will still have your one-time rehab available to you. For loans that defaulted after March 13th, the reason you're not eligible for Fresh Start is because they're going to take you out of default like you never defaulted in the first place, because you really shouldn't have because of COVID. Because of the COVID pause, nobody should have defaulted since March 13th. but especially there are some FFEL loans because of the timing of when they started looping in some of the FFEL loans to some of the COVID stuff. There are some of those borrowers that did default since March 13th. So those people, they're just going to reverse and pretend it never happened. But if you defaulted prior to March 13th of 2020, you will have to raise your hand. There's no additional collection costs that are going to be added. As I mentioned, it removes the default line from the credit report. I talked about the borrowers that had been stuck in default. Okay, so here's how you raise your hand. If you're in school, all you have to do is fill out the FAFSA and let your school know that you're, do whatever your school requires for you to get new Title IV aid. At that point, the school is going to request that you sign a very specific statement. And that statement basically says, I know that by accepting new aid, I'm also doing the Fresh Start program, and here's what that means. And at that point, the new aid is dispersed and the defaulted loans are sent to Nelnet. All the loans that go through Fresh Start are going to be sent. Nelnet is going to be their new servicer. For borrowers that aren't in school now and aren't going to be taking out new aid, as I mentioned, you just need to notify whoever is holding your loan right now. If you're not sure who that is, you go to studentaid.gov and you'll see who the current holder is, and that's who you reach out to about Fresh Start. Some borrowers are already getting Fresh Start. Other borrowers, especially borrowers with FFEL loans, they're probably not going to be able to actually get it until February, but it doesn't hurt to call now and ask about it. Once they do raise their hand saying they're interested, then the loan is going to be sent to Default Management Collection Service, DMCS, the Department of Ed's collection agency. And then once you fulfill the rest of your obligation, signing the statement you're supposed to sign, that loan will also go to Nelnet. And essentially, you need to make repayment arrangements of some sort. They're going to push you. It's going to seem like they're really pushing you to get on an income-driven plan. But if that's not the right plan for you, you don't have to get on an IDR to complete Fresh Start. But you do have to pick some repayment plan and agree to start making on-time payments on your loan in order for them to fulfill the Fresh Start. And then once you've done that, then they'll transfer your loan to Nelnet. This is just a copy of the statement that if you're in school, you'll have to sign. And then the school maintains that and so on. Now, this part's really interesting. Starting in February, all defaulted loans, whether the borrowers raise their hand or not, are going to be reported as current. And they'll remain being reported as current for the duration of the Fresh Start period. Now, the Fresh Start period has started, and it's going to end a year from the end of the payment pause. So if we assume that June of 2023 is the end of the payment pause, borrowers will have until May 3rd. Well, if it's June 30th, they'll have until June 29th of 2024 to raise their hand for Fresh Start. And until that time, their loan's still going to show in default on their credit report, but it's going to show that that defaulted loan is current. They're also going to remove all the loans from CAVers or CAVers, which is another type of credit reporting database that most mortgage lenders use. So they are removing the defaulted loans from CAVers right away as well. Now, if you do end up going forward with Fresh Start, they will delete the defaulted loan trade line like it was never there. And then Nelnet will start a new trade line on your in good standing loan. If you don't utilize Fresh Start, once the Fresh Start period is over, they're going to once again report your defaulted loan as in collections. The only exception to that are borrowers that have been in default for more than 7 years. In that case, they're just going to stop reporting it as defaulted and let it fall off like it should fall off after 7 years, and they're not going to re-report it once the 7 years is over, because the 7 years has already passed. For all loans that are eligible for Fresh Start, that means any loan that defaulted prior to March 13th of 2020, They are not going to do administrative wage garnishment or tax offset or social security offset or any other type of involuntary collections until the end of the Fresh Start period. And so again, till June of 2024. Once the payment pause is over, if you default, they're going to start doing offsets, federal offsets, 6 months after the pause ends. So you're looking at December of 2023. But they'll start doing administrative wage garnishment right away. So basically, everything's going to be back to normal, quote unquote, for new defaulted loans pretty much as soon as the pause is over or by December of that year. If someone happened to go through the loan rehabilitation process during COVID, they're just going to treat that like you did Fresh Start, and it will not count as your one and only rehab process. So again, hopefully you don't ever need rehab again because you're not going to default again, but that's how they're going to treat people that rehab during COVID. And then people that are in the process of rehabbing now should be very shortly receiving notifications that they don't have to make the rest of their rehab payments. They're just going to move forward with the Fresh Start. So whether they're 2 or 7 payments in, then they'll be able to, their loans will be put back in good standing. Any questions about Fresh Start?
Betsy, for borrowers that opt into Fresh Start, what happens with the accrued collection costs related to that defaulted loan?
Well, any collection costs that have already been posted are going to stay. If you remember, collection costs for the student loans are weird. So it's not like as soon as you default, like if you defaulted 100 grand, that they add 24% right out of the gate, and now you owe 124,000. What they do is every time a payment comes in, whether it be a voluntary payment or involuntary payment, they take 16% or 18% or 24% off that payment first. That's the collection costs. So for a normal rehab, although the Department of Ed hasn't been charging collection costs on rehabs for a few years now, but back when they did, so for a FEL loan that rehabbed, when you rehabbed, if you were rehabbing $100,000, they would add 16,000 to it, which is 16%, which is the collection cost for rehab. So because of this, because there's no collection costs and there's no payments involved, there's nothing to add. Does that make sense?
Yeah, just the accrued collections up to that point, but nothing after the fact.
Yeah, and anything that's accrued up to that point's already been paid because they accrue it as the payments come in.
Right.
And this probably doesn't make much sense to anyone other than you and I, but
another question came in. What is the length of time that it will take the Fresh Start borrowers' loans to get reassigned to Nelnet?
Supposedly it's, assuming that the borrower, signs what they're supposed to sign and does their payment arrangements, supposedly it's going to be within 30 days.
Okay.
But I'm going to have to see for myself.
Thank you. So I don't want to get into the weeds, although I think we're already there. So borrowers who are potentially eligible for debt relief or defaulted, just considerations around debt relief versus Fresh Start. Anything you want to share?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you have a direct loan that's in default, then you should do Fresh Start as soon as possible. You're not putting your debt relief at risk at all. The only ones that are a little squirrely are the FEL loans that never, ironically, defaulted FEL loans are eligible for the debt relief. It's the non-defaulted that aren't. But it has not been made 100% clear yet. But my understanding with this Fresh Start is that a FEL loan that takes advantage of Fresh Start becomes a Department of Ed held loan. So if you follow that train of thought, that should mean the loan is eligible for debt relief. But I haven't been able to get a definitive answer on that. So if I were a FEL borrower, especially a fell borrower where getting the 10 or 20 grand forgiven could mean a zero balance, I would hang tight for a minute and wait till we get in writing 100% guidance that a fresh start fell borrower would be eligible for the debt relief. Because if the answer is going to be, on the very slim chance the answer is going to be no, then you should stay in default until the debt relief comes through, or until the Supreme Court says no debt relief for anybody, whichever happens.
Thank you, Betsy. Another question in terms of the reassignment to Nelnet, and this is coming from a school, and just so you know, we've got still 26 folks who are still with us on the webinar. So there probably are some financial aid folks that might have questions related to this Fresh Start piece. But this follow-up one, we have a student that is eligible, but it doesn't look like their loans have been reassigned. Does the servicer contact them to do the signatures? We, the school, have collected the student signature with the statement.
How long ago did you collect the statement? I mean, it's supposed, listen.
2 months. The answer was 2 months.
Yeah, they're still really rolling out the Fresh Start piece of it. I'm not going to lose any sleep over that. But it is they will get notice from Nelnet once the loan gets moved over there. The borrower doesn't, once, the fact that they've signed the statement and the aid's been released, the borrower doesn't have to do anything else, and neither do you, other than make sure you keep that statement for 3 years. You have to keep it for 3 years as of the end of this academic year.
Great, thank you, Betsy. I think that is all we have for now, unless you see anything else, Mila, that's come up that I've missed, but I think that covers everything. I want to thank you, Betsy, I know we've gone over, but again, we've recorded it, and folks who could stay on did, and those who couldn't will certainly be able to review the webinar later. We want to thank you again for being such a wonderful resource and expert through this whole process. I have no doubt we will continue to engage you along the way and do future webinars as things get ironed out further. Do you want to take just a moment to talk about your resource, Betsy? And then before you leave, Mila, I want to talk about next month's webinar real quick as a reminder, but Betsy, just want to add anything about TSLA for the group?
No, just resources. Your best resources are the Department of Ed's website, studentaid.gov. Our organization, if you're not familiar with it, the Institute of Student Loan Advisors, or TSLA, we're a nonprofit that provides free, expert, and unbiased student loan advice to all consumers via email. I'd like to think that we have a pretty comprehensive website that's more importantly in plain English, and our website's right in front of you, freestudentloanadvice.org. So anybody can utilize it. We don't require a login. We don't collect any of your information. We have a ton of information, including some case studies on the IDR waiver on our site. So it's at the bottom of our IDR page, which is a pretty extensive page, but all the way at the bottom, there's a write-up on the IDR waiver you might find helpful. And then in that, there's an attachment that includes some case studies and a lot of FAQs about the IDR waiver that I suggest that you check out. And then if you are nerding out on this court case stuff, I've also provided the link to the Supreme Court docket that this case is on, and that's a good place to sort of keep an eye on things there. And I just want to thank Alice, the student loan cat, who has joined us. She's the one that was really answering all your questions. And she purrs through it. So she loves student loans even more than I do.
She's the real brains behind the operation, right, Betsy?
Right.
Yeah. So thank you for joining, everyone. As a reminder, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mila, chime in. So our next webinar, our Wednesday webinar, is on January 11th at 1 o'clock. And I believe we'll be doing an overview of the New Mainer website during that webinar, Mila?
Yeah, we're going to focus on new Mainers for January. We're going to talk a little bit about free community college because we want to be sure that students are still familiar with that, and those that are working with students, and even students who cannot are not eligible for federal student aid, that they can still get free community college here in Maine. We'll show you an updated version of our website, which includes a really cool tool to help you determine whether or not someone's eligible for federal student aid. And we'll share other additional resources that we're in the process of adding to the website. And last but not least, we'll talk about credentialing a little bit and how people can get credential evaluations and some resources to help them pay for that. So that's what's coming in January. We hope you'll join us.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mila. Thank you so much, everyone.
Betsy, thank you so much. It's just, I could listen to you all day long. So thank you so much.
I could talk about this stuff all day long. So. It's my pleasure. And just thank you for sponsoring this for your constituency. It's really important to get the information out there. So I think it's great that you do it.